Good morning. My name is Jim Capretta. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome those of you here in person today and those watching online to today's event, and to introduce our first speaker, Phillip Swagel, the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Our topic is the federal government's long-term fiscal outlook, with CBO's recently updated forecast serving as the launching point for the conversation. The traditional budget baseline covers 10 years. CBO's longer range projections extend out 30 years, which can be important when considering programs and tax policies that were adopted with a view to lasting across multiple generations. As usual with CBO's publications, the updated long-term forecast, as I noted, released last week, is full of insights and information that will be useful to policymakers and analysts as they consider the state of the nation's fiscal outlook. The plan for today is to have Phil provide some remarks summarizing what is in the report, after which he has agreed to engage in a follow-up conversation with me and answer some questions. To conclude his time with us, I will call on a couple of you for your questions. So now would be a good time to get them ready. For those who are viewing the event online, you can submit your questions via email by sending them to the following email address, cameron.tarbell@aei.org, and you can find that address and how to spell it on the event webpage online. After we're done, in the second part of our program, my AEI colleague Joe Antos will moderate a conversation with two respected economists and leading policy experts, Mark Roshawski of AEI and Louise Scheiner of Brookings, just down the street. Joe will give them a proper introduction when they come to the stage. They will then each offer some initial comments, followed by a discussion moderated by Joe. Now it is my pleasure to introduce someone who is not a stranger to AEI, Phil Swagel. Phillip Swagel became the 10th Director of the Congressional Budget Office on June 3rd, 2019. Previously, he was a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and, most importantly, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the Milken Institute. He has also taught at Northwestern University, the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and Georgetown University. His research has involved financial market reform, international trade policy, and China's role in the global economy. From 2006 to 2009, Dr. Swagel was an Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury Department, where he was responsible for analysis of a wide range of economic issues, including policies relating to the financial crisis and the Troubled Asset Relief Program. He has also served as Chief of Staff and Senior Economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, and as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board and the International Monetary Fund. He earned his PhD in economics from Harvard and his AB from Princeton, so he's got both covered. Thank you, Phil, for taking the time to join us today. Welcome.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah,
thanks so much. Great, thank you. Thanks, Jim, and thanks for everyone who's here, and thanks to everyone watching on video. And it's really a pleasure to be here in person, and also to be in an event with Joe, Mark, and Louise. I guess I'm your warm-up act. Is that? So, and I'm happy to take questions from anyone on any topic. So I'll give a quick overview of the long-term budget outlook, and then we can get to questions, which of course are the most interesting. So let me just start by noting the projections that we released last week on the long-term budget outlook. That, as Jim said, they go out 30 years. In May, at the end of May, we released our 10-year outlook. So of course the 30-year picks up at the end of the 10th year, and so there's one integrated set of projections. The economic forecast that's embedded in the 10-year horizon was actually finalized at the very beginning of March. The work was done mainly in January and February, finalized at the beginning of March, which has some implications that, in some senses, we got the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but not so much the part where the Ukrainians have been doing well. So, which obviously has implications. And then the last thing is that the budget projections include legislation enacted through early April, but obviously this is a current law basis. All the projections are in current law, so legislation that's being discussed now, of course, is not in the projections. But I'm happy to take questions about any of this. Okay, so let me just start by showing two familiar charts on debt and deficits. And so the debt trajectory, I think, is a familiar one, that the debt to GDP ratio has been rising over time and is projected to continue to rise. What I want to focus on in the chart are a couple of things that I think are interesting. And so the first thing I'll note are the two crises over the last 2 decades. So of course, one is the coronavirus pandemic, it's noted here, and then the second is the Great Recession in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008 and on. So in some ways, it's not surprising that the debt to GDP level rose considerably, right? That ratio rose considerably. Policymakers undertook fiscal policy responses to both crises. Of course, monetary policy played a key role in the responses to both the crises, but fiscal policy did as well. And so it's not surprising that the debt ratio increased, as you can see in the chart. Now look at the projection period, and of course it evolves smoothly. So in our 30-year projection period, we do not have another crisis in there. Right? But, in some sense, we've seen the recent past. We don't know what the future crises will be, what will require a fiscal response in the future. But I think it's pretty, it seems pretty reasonable to expect that there might be something in the future. So there's a sense in which, we try to go in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. But there's a sense in which what's unknown is not in here. So policymakers might want to be cautious and just understand there could be future fiscal needs, and I'll come back to that. Very good. And then I think that's the most important thing in this debt trajectory. And of course, the debt to GDP ratio is one way of looking at the fiscal trajectory. It's by far not the only one. Good. Here, let me move forward then, and just look for a moment at one other way of looking at the fiscal situation, and this is the flow burden in a sense. It shows that the deficit is a share of GDP, and then breaks that down between net interest outlays and then the primary deficit, everything else other than interest outlays. And you can see the fiscal responses to the two crises as the deficit widens out, again, during the pandemic and during the previous financial crisis, and then comes back down. And that's what we have for this year, that the pandemic spending, of course, falls off sharply in 2022, and so the deficit narrows substantially. And so that's clearly shown in the chart. The challenge is that the primary deficit, right, so leaving off net interest outlays, was wide already before the pandemic and is set to remain wide after the pandemic. And you can see that in the chart with the purple, it says the purple region. It gets a bit bigger, but not too much bigger. So one is the primary deficit is already pretty big. So even if interest rates remain low, which we have a pretty moderate path of interest rates, the wide primary deficit means the debt ratio will rise, and in terms of the flow burden and the carrying cost of the debt will rise as well. And that's what you can see here in the blue is net interest outlays. And again, this is a share of GDP, so it's nominal dollars over nominal dollars, and you can see that that widens out. That presents a couple of challenges. Right? One is just the sort of the feedback loop, right? Of course, that rising net interest outlays mean wider deficits into the future, and wider deficits mean rising debt and more interest outlays, and so on. So there's a feedback loop. The second is the composition of federal spending. Right? Depending on what the revenue path will be in the future, rising net interest outlays, in some sense, put pressure on policymakers, on the choices available to policymakers. Right? Either we can have a higher revenue share, or there's other choices on the outlay side. So in some sense, that's I would say a part of the fiscal challenge. And there's a sense in which before the pandemic, when interest rates are still pretty moderate, right, one way of looking at the trajectory was that, in instances, even as the debt ratio got larger, say after the financial crisis, that low interest rates meant that the carrying cost of the debt remained low, or remained moderate. It's still the case, right? It's still the case now. Net interest payments are at 1.6% of GDP, again in nominal terms. Those are set to rise over the 10-year horizon to more than double, up to 3.3% of GDP, and then double again, out to 7.4% of GDP by the end of the 30-year horizon. And there's a sense in which the flow burden is now part of the challenge, right? That we face. Okay. I'm not going to go through every detail of the LTBO. I'm just going to hit a few highlights and then stop, and Jim and I will talk and take questions. Of course, CBO takes no policy positions, right? So we have no normative view on what the right level of revenues and what the right level of outlays is. And of course, that goes into, well, what's the size of the government and what's the role of government in our society? And so we support the Congress with our analysis and not our opinion. But ultimately, that's what the discussion is about, is the role and the size of the government in society. This is just the projection. So you can see the revenue as a share of GDP, it goes up modestly over the 30-year horizon. You can see actually what's happening right now is we had very strong revenues in 2021. We're waiting to see what happens in 2022. Our projections have the strength of revenues in 21 fading, so we do not continue with the extraordinary strength of revenues in our projections going forward. And I can talk more about that in the future. A lot of the 2017 tax act expires in 2026, so the personal income side, those tax rates expire, and you can see there's a bump up in revenues at that time. Outlays are on a different path, right? So that includes net interest outlays that we saw on the previous chart, and then this is a more traditional long-term challenge of entitlement spending, Social Security, and the major healthcare programs. Good. So this just drills down and shows what's coming. Let me just quickly drill down further into the composition of spending. And again, this is more ways of seeing the same thing. So it's the total share of GDP for different pieces of outlays. And again, this is the middle top row shows you another view of what's happening with net interest outlays, that they're rising as a share of GDP, right? They're still moderate, right? 1.6% of GDP today, but rising out above 7% over the 30-year horizon. The major healthcare programs continue to increase in cost. One of the things that we did this year in the LTBO was re-examine our methodology relating to long-term growth of healthcare. How much does healthcare spending rise above and beyond nominal GDP? And we actually decided that we had overstated that in the past. And so that is actually that put downward movement in the long-term fiscal trajectory in this report. And then you see some of the other components of outlays. I'll just highlight the bottom right. So I guess the southeast on the chart is discretionary spending. Now that is set by a formula, right? For the first 10 years, there's actually a statutory formula that discretionary spending rises with inflation, but that means it does not keep pace in our projections with the size of the economy. Since of course after the first half of the year, real GDP growth was negative in the data we have so far. But beyond that, we do have positive GDP growth in our projection. So discretionary spending as a share of GDP falls modestly over the 10-year horizon in our projections, and then is flat. We just keep it flat as a share of nominal GDP. We can look around the world and see the challenges, and there's so many things that are funded out of discretionary spending. Well, we saw yesterday that the Senate enacted a bill, the PACT Act on toxic waste exposures, where the VA is funded by discretionary spending. And that bill changes some of it. It takes some of the discretionary spending and moves it over into mandatory spending. But most activities of the VA are discretionary spending. And so there are future challenges there. Well, that would not show up in our projections. The same thing if national security expenditures are larger in the future than the current share of those expenditures of GDP, that would mean more discretionary spending, and so on. And so again, this is not our view of what discretionary spending should be, but it's just a formula. It's a baseline. Good, and then the same thing with revenues, and I pointed out already what's going on in the individual income tax, and you can see it again in the middle top. The strength in 2021, we have that coming down, and of course, nominal income will continue to grow with high inflation, so nominal revenues will rise, keep pace at least with nominal incomes, but we don't have the kind of extraordinary revenues that we had in 2021. We don't extend those forward. Let's see. Okay, good. I'll just say a few more words on what else we do in the report, and then I'll just conclude with some last thoughts. And I know this is everything here is all the challenges and all the concerns. So the last thing I'm going to say is about why I'm still optimistic. So I just not gonna leave everyone bummed out at the end, including myself. So in the report, we do some sensitivity analysis. This shows you one version of that. Well, what if interest rates are higher or lower than we have in our projections? We have a pretty moderate interest rate path, especially as the debt ratio goes up and the flow burden of the debt goes up. One might think that interest rates could respond to that. We have some of that, but it's not a huge amount of interest rate reaction, and this just shows more or less. And so the punchline is the fiscal trajectory, as shown here by the debt ratio, is still challenging. And of course, there's lots of other ways to look at the fiscal trajectory, lots of other measures. They're correlated with this one. So I'm showing you one, and obviously it's better or worse by looking at others. Here, and then the same things. This looks at what if GDP growth is stronger or weaker. And this actually shows a really large change in GDP growth, 50 basis points of stronger or weaker productivity growth, which is a huge amount. And again, the message is the same, that the fiscal path is still pretty challenging. We do one other simulation, a sensitivity analysis on discretionary spending, looking at, well, what if discretionary spending is more than in our central projection, than in our baseline. Now I'm going to skip forward, but this is all taken from the charts. Let me skip to the end then. At the same time as we released the long-term budget outlook last week, we also released a separate report on the demographic outlook. And of course, those are closely connected. Actually, when you're at CBO, everything looks connected to the fiscal situation. And demographics is a key part of it, and it's a fascinating way that the demographic changes feed into the fiscal outlook. And of course, we know the pandemic affected mortality, is very sad, and that affects both the near-term and the long-term fiscal trajectory. The pandemic affected fertility and immigration as well. And so this just gives one view of that, which is looking at births and deaths of the people who are living in the U.S., and then immigration. And you can see that in our projections that not too far out in the future, by 2043, deaths of people born in the US exceed births. And so 100% of US population growth, more than 100% of net population growth, comes from immigration. All right, so I have a list here in the slides of lots of other issues, and I suspect we'll get to some of them, so I'm not going to talk about each of these. But I'll put it up just to say, the way I see it is that a part of the fiscal challenge is that it's not like we just have the fiscal challenge and there's no other issues. And so I just listed a number of other issues that are affecting the economy and facing policymakers in the near term and in the long term. And we can, of course, talk about these. And of course, CBO is working on various aspects of all of these. And I'll finish by just saying, despite all these challenges, despite the daunting fiscal trajectory, I'm still optimistic. And so why am I optimistic? And it's, in some sense, I look at this list of issues, I say we as a nation can address all of these, right? We're a dynamic economy, we're an innovative economy, and we saw that during the pandemic. We're a flexible economy, and again, during the pandemic, we certainly saw that. And then importantly, people want to come here, right? It's people want to come here, immigrants want to come here, and capital wants to come here as well. And we see that. We saw that during the pandemic, that when things are difficult around the world, both of those things happen. Capital wants to be here, and people want to be here. So ultimately, that's got to be the biggest vote of confidence in us as a nation and as an economy. So Jim, why don't I stop there?
Yeah, very good.
And happy to talk about anything.
Yeah. I got a few questions for you.
Okay, and I don't know if, maybe I'll hold the clicker in case we need to move to any
hold
slides.
On to that, actually. Yeah. Good, thank you, that was excellent.
That's great. No, thank you.
Thank you for that overview. I'm planning in my questions to drag us back down into pessimism, so I'm just kidding. Let's start first with, thank you, that was excellent. I really, I'm sure everyone got a lot out of trying to just get the basics of what's in the report. And both, it's important to know that there are two reports. There's the demographic report and the fiscal projection report, both of which are highly useful. But let's go maybe just to a topic right at the top, because it's of interest to so many people, that is not directly in the report, but is so top of mind for everybody right now, which is the, as you indicated, the economic assumptions were set in about March or so. For the president's budget was all the way back in October of last year. So for both sets of projections that are guiding some of the policymaking, there's a lot of things that have happened. And especially the advent of a much higher level of inflation. And I imagine many of your top-notch people looking at this at CBO. How are you thinking about that in terms of where we are, your risks, the fiscal risks, the maybe fiscal benefits? How are you thinking about it analytically relative to your baseline? Which I know this is not a criticism. This is just saying that inflation is going to be a lot higher in 2022 that's in your baseline.
No, that's right.
And the question is, how do you think about where this goes next?
Okay, no, of course. And as you said, on the one hand, we did the forecast a few months ago, and by the time we published the report, it's out of date. On the other hand, inflation really was much higher than we expected. We had high inflation, and inflation so far in this year, at least by 3 of the 4 measures, has been much higher than we expected. Yeah. Core PCE inflation until the last month was reasonably close to our forecast. But in the last month, core PCE has been much higher, and it looks to be much higher out into the future. So so we missed. We missed inflation. Well, obviously, we're not the only ones. And that feeds into the fiscal trajectory. Now, as you said, actually, I'm going to stick with optimism for a second. We've all learned that inflation is not a happy thing for the country, for the economy, for society. On the other hand, the government, U.S. government, is a large net borrower. And unexpected inflation for a borrower that borrows in domestic currency, mostly at fixed interest rates. Of course, there's some tips that have adjustable interest rates, but mostly we're a fixed rate borrower. And the duration of the Treasury debt right now is out to about 74 months. Our projections look carefully at the composition of Treasury debt, which is the longest duration, at least in the data that we track. So the Treasury, in a sense, benefits from this unexpected inflation. Obviously, that's not by far not saying that I'm saying anyone at the Treasury wanted this inflation, but there is that fiscal benefit to it, and I'm sure we can talk more about that. So then, second, what does it mean for the fiscal projections? For our outlook, that is kind of interesting, actually. That inflation affects both sides of the federal balance sheet. Right, so revenues and spending. Revenues are higher, right? We tax nominal income bases, wages and profits and so on, and those are higher. Revenues in 21 were higher even than could be explained by the nominal income bases that we have, by gross domestic income, for example, on the personal income side, or wages on the Social Security and Medicare contributions. So we're looking at that carefully. And obviously the data can change, right? And so data are revised, and so it could be the income was just higher last year than the data show us so far. Or that would explain things too. But there's lots of other explanations. Okay, so income is doing well. Revenues are doing well. Spending goes up with inflation as well. Right? The federal government has transfers that are inflation adjusted and buys lots of things. It turns out when we look carefully at this, those two cancel each other out, which is really interesting. What doesn't get canceled out is net interest outlays, right? So the primary balance is almost unaffected by inflation just because revenues and non-interest spending offset, but the impact is through interest payments. And there's a sense in which that goes with the chart I put up. I'm sorry, I'm pointing at the monitor that I can see. That's the risk, is higher interest rates that then feed into the deficit.
Interesting, very good. Back to this question then, the advent of higher inflation has led to a monetary policy adjustment. And I think a lot of people think the risks of a recession have gone up. Now, we're not there's all kinds of debate. We don't need to get into debate about whether we're in one now or not, but just generally the possibility of a contraction occurring seems to have gone up somewhat based on the Federal Reserve having to adjust based on the realities of the last 6 to 9 months. If we were to go into a recession, not saying we are in one, if we were to go into one and it lasted 9 months or something, would it affect the long-term outlook, or would the presumed recovery out of it sort of just even it out after 5 years anyway? I mean, how do you think, does it create a permanent hole that makes the whole situation worse, or is it something that just sort of evens out with an assumed recovery?
No, it's a great question. It's something we're thinking about both with the current cycle and then just the pandemic overall. So our relatively benign outlook on inflation and unemployment and growth in part reflects our expectation that about half of the people who are still on the sidelines, still out of the labor force, as a result of the pandemic, are coming back. So about 2.1 million people, our labor force is lower by that many as compared to the pre-pandemic trajectory. So we have about half of those coming back in, the next year. And then over time, we have the rest of them coming back. So we have our labor force trajectory getting back to the pre-pandemic trajectory with the changes in fertility and mortality and so on. But we have the sort of people out of the labor force just for pandemic reasons that whittling away over time. If that's wrong, right, so if the sort of post-pandemic economy does not have as many people, well, then potential would be lower. And so it's the same thing. In some sense, it's the same thing with inflation. That if the high inflation leads, as you said, to a recession, the sort of the monetary policy induced recession, which of course we don't see. That's not in our projections, and I think we all understand the risks. But if that happens, then what does it mean for the long term depends on the long-term factors of what happens to the labor force, what happens to capital investment, and what happens to productivity. And we would look at that and build it into our long-term trajectory of potential output. It's a tough one. What are the long-term impacts of recessions? We know there are. I mean, it's history. Actually, Blanchard and Summers, right, did really crucial work on hysteresis of recessions, the long-term impacts of recessions. But it's something we would be keenly aware of.
Thank you. Okay, back to something you raised in the conversation, which is this conversation that's been ongoing now for some time about, if we have, if interest rates are low, it might in advanced economies, it might allow for sustaining higher levels of debt relative to the size of the economy. So there's this conversation amongst many economists in recent years. I've always wondered, though, just the recent episode on inflation sort of brings up the question, if that logic holds, does it provide an incentive to move toward an easier monetary policy so that we have lower interest rates and therefore isn't this sort of just the same incentive that's always been there to kind of, not to put too negative a term on it, but sort of monetize the debt, so to speak, that you can accommodate higher borrowing from the public sector with easy money, but easy money feeds into higher inflation. Isn't there a sort of a circle here?
Right. I mean, that is the risk, right? That is the risk that higher inflation will then feed into higher interest rates throughout the yield curve. We don't see that right now. I mean, obviously, interest rates have gone up over the past 6 to 12 months as inflation has risen. But more recently, as people start to worry about recession or sort of a hard landing scenario, of course, interest rates have come back down again.
Yeah.
So we certainly don't see in market indicators the kind of expectation of high inflation persisting out past 5 years or 10 years, and therefore interest rates have gone up. So that we don't have. It's a risk, and that's part of my job is to point out risks to policymakers. I say one thing I didn't say from the podium, but is still the case, is that policymakers have the ability to take further fiscal action. And again, the Senate passed legislation last night. The president I think will sign it, and that is fiscal action. And there's other fiscal policy being considered by the Congress, and there is the ability to do that. The fiscal crisis is not it's not today, it's not tomorrow, it's not, there's not some set point at which, the economy is really impaired.
Right. Very good. Okay, let's get back into some of the aspects of the actual report again. I want to talk about something that was sort of near the end of the report, something my colleague Mark pointed out to me. It's the change in methodology, which you mentioned, about the healthcare side of it. I'm just to read a sentence that was in there. It says, you lowered your assumptions about the additional cost growth for Medicare and also Medicaid and non-Medicare health spending. And it's had this interesting sentence. It said, that expectation largely stems from the agency view that lower prices would cause some providers to decline to treat patients insured under Parts A and B, and might also reduce providers' incentives to adopt innovative services and technologies. For those who don't know, Medicare has built into it a pretty strict system of updating both hospital services and physician services over time. Both are essentially below nominal inflation, well below nominal inflation. And so there's a real reduction in the payment rates per service. How do you think about that? Is that what's going on here? Am I reading this right in terms of that then affects sort of the assumption about who's willing to provide services and how much use is going to go on? How do you react to that?
No, that is part of it. And it's not the same as saying, okay, Medicare patients are not going to have providers to go to. This is a beginnings of a change that comes in over time.
Yeah.
It's a strength of the work at CBO is the relationship between the work done by our budget analysis division that focuses on cost estimates, and then what we call our program divisions that do the longer term analyses. And in healthcare especially, the work is really tightly integrated between the different pieces of CBO. And so we did a lot of work for the chairman of the budget committee, which is Senator Sanders. We did a lot of work for him on single payer healthcare. And it's one of the things that we looked at carefully is what is the impact of lower payment rates? Well, what would that do to providers? And it turns out there is evidence that providers, such as hospitals, become more efficient. So when payment rates to hospitals go down, they do become more efficient. Now, there's other impacts as well, but that is one of them. And with providers such as physicians, there's some of them get more efficient, and some of them say, well, look, no, I'm going in a different direction. I'm not accepting those payment rates. Actually, I'm sorry, now I'm going on, but one last thought, which is there's no normative judgment here, right? So we're not, CBO, of course, has no view on how many physicians should take Medicare, what the right payments are. We're just trying to say what the impact is.
Yeah, got it. I do think it's an interesting, though, dynamic that could be important in the future. Related to that, the one that's really jumped off the page to me was the projection of the non-Medicare spending in 2052 relative to 2022. That's basically Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. Just from memory, I believe it's like in 2022, it's 2.8% of GDP is spent on those combined programs. And then 30 years out, it's only going to be 2.9% of GDP. Yeah, which is a pretty moderate, obviously, change for especially Medicaid, and which serves a lot of elderly people and so on. So, I mean, is that how do you think about that? I mean, it seems like there could be huge pressure on Medicaid from long-term care services going forward. How do you think about that? And I know it's all coming out of your modeling, and there's a lot of stuff. But how do you think about that?
No, you're exactly right. And so I flip back. I don't know if on the screen people are watching remotely can see, but I flip back to the chart that show outlays by component. And I should say these charts are on the CBO website as well. I think they're probably on the AEI webpage, but they're on the CBO website as well.
They will be. We put the slides up from the presentation.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, no, very good. And so you can see, as Jim said, the share of GDP of the major healthcare programs, it goes up, but it's not, it's sort of not like a rocket ship going up to the moon here. And so, we try to be in the middle of range of possible outcomes. But yes, one can imagine if the services available to beneficiaries are not satisfactory, and we see that already, right? Medicaid beneficiaries have very complete coverage, but they don't always have access. And mental health services, for example, is one of them. Actually, it's a challenge, much more broadly, including on commercial insurance. And so, if that is not satisfactory, well, that would imply, higher cost pressures than we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's just an upside risk. There's several, and there are downside risks. I mean, there's potential for the other direction too, so I understand that. On slides 9 and 10, just one last observation. We're going to get to our audience questions here in just a few minutes, so get them ready, everyone, and send them in. But back to slides 9 and 10, going back in time, looking back at the historical spending levels, for discretionary spending, just my quick calculation was since 1990, the average of discretionary, that's non-defense and defense, has been about 7.5% of GDP on average per year since 1990. So that's after the Cold War basically concluded. And going all the way back to 1962, obviously we had much, the Vietnam War and other things. It was 8.9% of GDP, so it was higher, decades ago than it is now. Now it has been in certain years as low as 6.2. It's been low in certain years. So your projection is basically fixed at 7% of GDP going forward. And,
this is on discretionary.
Discretionary, yeah.
So discretionary, I pulled a table just with some of the key numbers. Whereas a discretionary we have going from it was 7.3% last year, goes down to 7 this year.
And you hold it at 7, basically.
7, and then it goes out by the end of the 30-year projection. It goes down to 6.
6, okay.
And that comes about both the numerator and denominator. So it's going down in the near term, both because of high inflation. So the denominator is getting larger. Nominal GDP is getting larger, and then also because discretionary spending by statute in our projections is adjusted only for inflation, but not for real GDP.
Yeah, right. So anyway, my observation was that if it was at 7, that the number goes to 218%. Public debt goes to 218% of GDP in 2052, which is in the report.
And we do have some of those, right? Some of those.
I mean, this is just another question about where are we with discretionary? I mean, given the competitive posture with China and the defense, there's huge pressures on defense spending right now. Aging population, climate change. It just seems like on the discretionary side, there's still a lot of things out there that could. I know there's some savings probably there, but I wonder if the savings that are potentially there are way outweighed by people saying we got to do a lot more if we're going to compete with China. We're going to have to do a lot more on climate, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about that?
All right, so I'm going to prove 2 things. One is that
you don't take positions.
We don't take. Not only do we not take positions, we don't tell Congress what to do because at the end of this year, we don't even suggest to Congress what they should do, what members should do. At the end of this year, we will publish our book of budget options that CBO publishes every 2 years. The wide range of both spending and revenue changes to reduce the deficit. One of those changes will be to reduce defense spending by a very substantial amount, right? Because we're going to focus on measures that make a real change, a meaningful change in the fiscal trajectory. And as you hinted at, we don't expect the Congress to undertake that meaningful change, reduction in defense spending. But it's there as an option along with revenue changes and other spending changes. And in some sense to provide members with information on what is the magnitude of the change that's really needed to bend the fiscal trajectory. And
there will be policy. I know your group, even on the defense side, does policy options about the fiscal implications of redoing postures and so on. And so it's just sort of a modeling exercise, not necessarily a policy exercise.
That's right. It's a CBO with our fiscal lenses on, which are almost always the lenses that we have on.
Good. Yeah. Well, to drag us down into pessimism again, so I'm going to just ask one last question. Then we're going to get we have a couple of good audience questions, and I want to see if anyone here wants to ask something.
Okay.
So the last thing is sort of on the risks. Your report does a good job. It's repeated in many reports now I've seen over the last few years of just saying to the policy community, policymakers, look, here are the risks that are attendant to higher and growing debt. What could happen under certain scenarios? I'm wondering, is there a modeling that can be done, and maybe a question is, should it be done to say under one of the risk scenarios, which I think is sort of the prominent one, which is at some point, the ability to borrow, the ability to sell bonds might, there might be just a noticeable shift in the demand for the bonds eventually, maybe internationally in part. And, you end up paying 2 or 3 percentage points more than you thought, over a series of auctions, and suddenly, all of a sudden, the net interest payments start to look very different going forward. Is there a way to model what, how that would cascade through? What would happen exactly? Could there be how would a crisis emerge, so to speak?
Right. No. In substance, it is something that we've thought about. We've done some initial modeling exercises about what would a set of negative shocks look like, so a recession scenario. And we have a modeling technology that is basically like a mini version of our budget framework. So the way we do the budget trajectory is that we start with the economics, and then the budget analysts within CBO go line by line in the federal budget and project out 10 years. If the federal government spends on it, we have an expert on it. So that's one approach. It takes, as you can imagine, it just takes time. That's what we do for the baseline. We also then have a mini model that tries to do that at a more aggregate level with less, without the sort of, line by line judgment of that. And so we have done that. We said, okay, what if, here's a couple of key macro variables, the unemployment rate, GDP growth, and so on. Let's put really negative paths for those. And then say, based on the historical relationships within the economy, what does that mean for the economy? What does that mean for for fiscal policy? And so it's a Bayesian VAR, essentially what we're doing. It's a methodology pioneered out of the University of Minnesota. And we've done a bunch of simulations of that. And you can get some pretty negative outcomes. The challenge there is that the historical relationships basically are pretty benign. That, when the economy gets bad, monetary and fiscal policy respond, and the economy gets better. And that's the historical relationships. So things look bad for a bit, and the fiscal situation is bad for a bit, and then we come out of it, we get better, which is that's the way this country works, right? We take on the challenges, we get better. We are working to be more pessimistic, or again, not for us to be more pessimistic, that was the wrong way of putting it. We are working to provide policymakers with additional ways of looking at it, to say, okay, what if things really go wrong? And so, of course, we're going to do it symmetrically. What if there's really a good outcome? But what if, instead of both the numerator and denominator of the fiscal measures go in the wrong direction? So interest rates are higher, inflation's higher, deficits are wider, and growth slows down. So that'd be like the kind of hard landing scenario that you alluded to earlier. So we are working on that. So I don't have that yet, but I'm hoping to provide more on that in the future.
Very good, thank you. Okay, we have quick time for just a couple of questions, and we are going to get a microphone to this gentleman over here who can ask a question, and then I have one online that I want to also ask. So go ahead, sir. Please just state your name and ask a quick question.
My name is Roger Cochetti, and I thought the last question, by the way, was politically the most important, because the kitchen table level of debates over this subject often go back to what I will call modern monetary theory. So I don't think any discussion with CBO about the long-term budget outlook can take place without giving you a chance to comment on the modern monetary theory critique of virtually everything you've had to say. And for those who don't follow this, to paraphrase it for brevity, it would say, number one, this is all poppycock, the Chicken Little.
Okay.
We owe the debt to ourselves, and we got a very big gun. So if you don't,
I can answer. I'll explain as part of my answer.
Let me just quickly for those.
So go ahead and get to the question mark.
Get to the question.
Get to the question mark.
For the foreign ones, we have 1,000 military bases and 13 aircraft carriers.
Get to the question mark. Get to the question mark.
The question is, could you comment on the whole critique of everything that underlies this discussion, because it's politically very important.
He can respond. He's
it's great. It's a great question. And so I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to, it's just
we're mindful of time too.
Yeah. So somebody should talk. Okay, no, it's great. So I'll say two things. One is that we have we look at that. We look at everything, and so we read widely, including constructive criticisms. There's a sense in which I would say that, the work that's been done in that direction, it seems like it's kind of closer to political philosophy on the role of the government than to an economic methodology. To the extent that there's a methodological component to it, it seems like it's kind of awkward in the current circumstance, because it would imply that fiscal policy should be contractionary, that, since the policy response to high inflation, the first one would be don't have high inflation, right? So that'd be the first, so the first policy response, which I get, and no one, we've learned a lot about the cost of high inflation. So, but if there is high inflation, right, so don't have high inflation, here's 10 things one could do not to have high inflation, I think that's kind of the first policy kind of stuff that comes out of that view. But then once there is high inflation, it doesn't have a lot to say that's practical, because it's basically fiscal retrenchment, which goes contrary to the political philosophy. So, we've tried to learn, and we've tried to, we've tried to learn. But you're right; it doesn't show up in our projections, just because it doesn't seem well connected to the economic situation. That's what I would say.
I promised Phil I'd have him out at 10:45, and
Okay.
I'm going to violate that by asking one
last
question. This is the
Good.
last one.
No, that's great. That's great.
You mentioned there is some evidence, this is from an online question. You mentioned that there was some evidence that hospital systems become somewhat more efficient under single payer. And others, it's a little bit hard to determine. Can you spell out the economic evidence, and how did you come to that conclusion? What did you look at?
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, no, very good. And I'll give the short answer.
Yeah.
So we've done a huge amount of work on single payer healthcare systems. We have not done a cost estimate of any one bill. The major proposals are not detailed enough for us to do a cost estimate. So we've done work that highlights key choices. So one is provider payments, different administrative costs, different drug pricing regimes. And so to understand the impact of higher and lower provider payments, we had to look at the empirical evidence. And it's very interesting. And we had to look at different providers, in urban areas and rural areas, hospitals, physicians, other medical professionals. And there would be impacts at all horizons. Ultimately, changes in provider payments would affect who becomes a physician in the future, right? I mean, it's just natural. People have choices in their professions. In the near term, there is economic evidence that hospitals in particular become more efficient as the payments go down. I don't have the citation offhand. It's in our
I think MedPAC might have assembled some of that evidence
very good.
too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have a super health analysis team. Carrie Kalla is the division director, and she came to us from Dartmouth's policy. Well, their health policy group is at Hitchcock in their medical school. So look there for that evidence. And again, that is not saying that is a good thing. It's not saying hospitals should get less money. We're just saying that there is evidence that they are able to adapt. The other thing that's interesting in the report is single-payer healthcare would, as we sketched it out, and again, this is not saying we should do it or not do it, it changes the balance of payments, right? So providers who are receiving relatively high payments would tend to get less in the schemes that we examined, whereas providers who are getting paid less would tend to get a bit more. So providers that focus on Medicaid patients, for example, might actually see higher payments, where of course the very top hospital groups and physician groups would get less. And so that's there'd be those kinds of changes, absolutely.
All right, very good. That's the last word.
Okay.
Thank you.
No,
Please join me in thanking Phil for coming today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Give our crew here 2 minutes to do a transition, and the panel will come up.
So we're going to continue this discussion of CBO's long-term fiscal analysis with a panel. Just make a comment about something that Phil Swagel mentioned. He said that CBO doesn't tell Congress what to do. Well, in my experience at CBO, there were a lot of complaints, at least in the pre-COVID era, in the pre-multi-trillion-dollar legislation that we seem to have broken through the barrier from billions to trillions in Congress. But before that, members of Congress on both sides always wanted to say that we couldn't do something because of the CBO score. So I think we'll probably be seeing that. And actually, even now, the Inflation Reduction Act, clearly CBO's score has a lot to do with a certain senator's willingness to support it. He wanted to see some budget savings. Whether we actually see budget savings, of course, is another question, but the CBO score does play an important role in that regard. So does CBO tell Congress what to do? It's a matter of opinion. Anyway, we're going to take a little closer look at a few issues. I'm Joe Antos with the American Enterprise Institute, and a few brief comments before I introduce the panel. CBO's report provides valuable insights into the factors that shape our budgetary and fiscal future. In other words, our future. CBO is careful to point out that the long-term budget outlook is highly uncertain. I want to point out that this is also true for CBO's 10-year estimates of specific legislation. It's just that the further out you go, the greater the uncertainties loom, in the sense that a relatively small deviation on some factor that you're assuming in your estimate, a relatively small deviation may not show up as very large over a 10-year period, but over a 40-year period, it gets pretty significant. So, I would view this report as directional in a sense, and of course you can accept whether the direction is right or not according to your own views about how the economy works and what might happen in the future. But it's directional. It's clearly not a prediction. It is a projection. And indeed, when you saw Phil's slides, you saw that they became very smooth after about year 10. That is the definition of a projection. Now, the big challenge with projections is, of course, and this is true also for predictions, has to do with the assumptions that you make. Everything depends on assumptions. And again, the assumptions probably don't hold as well over a 40-year period as they might over a 10-year period. But indeed, over a 10-year period, you can argue about whether the assumptions are valid there as well. Something that wasn't emphasized in the previous discussion, but I think is very important, is the assumption that of current law. And what does current law mean? Phil alluded to that, but I'll expand on that a little bit. Current law means that if a bill hasn't been passed yet, it can't be included in the projection. You cannot assume something that hasn't happened yet. But the other side of this is also problematic. Just because a law has been passed doesn't mean that the effects that you would expect if the law was fully implemented for 40 years would actually happen. In other words, current law doesn't mean that there won't be changes in the future. And in particular, I wanted to highlight, if I can find it in my notes here, I wanted to highlight a statement from the Medicare trustees, the Medicare actuaries, which puts a little sharper edge on a point that Phil alluded to and Jim alluded to. In particular, this has to do with the Medicare spending. And one of the problematic features of current law is that there is something called a productivity adjustment, which automatically lowers payment rates to hospitals depending on whether the medical sector is keeping up with average productivity gains in the rest of the economy. There's some question about what that means. It's very difficult to measure productivity in healthcare. But nonetheless, Congress did that in order to generate savings in the out years for the Affordable Care Act. So here's a rather grim perspective from the Medicare actuaries. They say that more than 2/3 of hospitals are losing money on Medicare inpatient services right now, and that 1/3 of hospitals will potentially could be on the losing end of Medicare payments by 2040, raising the possibility of access and quality of care issues for Medicare beneficiaries. Now, what Phil said is that they're not really making a comment on whether access will in fact be impinged. And they're also not saying anything directly about the participation of providers in the Medicare program. But nonetheless, given the unrelenting reduction year after year after year in a formulaic policy like this, if Congress really were to keep it up, clearly there would be at least fiscal problems and probably financial problems in the hospital industry. However, Congress has a pretty much unbroken record of not actually allowing formulaic policies to continue past the point where these kinds of real and political problems can occur. So that adds to the question about how good are the CBO's 40-year estimates? And the answer is, again, they're projections, they're not predictions. If you're going to make a prediction, you probably wouldn't assume that a policy that's on its face seems impractical will continue forever. But that's CBO's burden. One other point that I think is very important is that we'll also be discussing in this panel has to do with whether we're really looking at the right economic indicators. There are a lot of numbers in the report, and you can find a lot of other reports that have a lot of numbers. You look at business analysts; they have their own set of numbers to look at, but with regard to the fiscal outlook, there's generally a focus on the size of the debt and deficit, and as one of Phil's charts has it, the sort of the carrying cost of the debt. And there's a real question about whether that's the only way to look at it, and whether that's looking at what is essentially outgo isn't leaving out an important factor, which is how are we spending the money? We're building up a debt or a deficit, and if you only look at that side of it, you're not paying enough attention, in my view, to how the money is being spent and whether it should be spent in another way, and whether, in fact, that spending is going to lead to enhanced economic growth or will discourage economic growth. These are all major factors that you cannot reduce down to one number, which adds to the pleasure and agony of looking at this report. Because if you ask yourself, well, so what do I conclude? The answer is, I'm not sure. And with that, let me introduce the panel. This is in the order of speakers. Mark Roshawski is let me see here. I seem to have misplaced my notes on the introduction. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a briefer introduction than I had intended. Mark Roshawski is the Searle Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He works on long-term care, Social Security issues, has a long history with a series of federal agencies and private firms. He was Deputy Commissioner for Retirement and Disability Policy at the Social Security Administration immediately before joining AEI. But prior to that, he had numerous other high-level positions. He was Vice Chair of the Federal Commission on Long-Term Care. He was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy in the Treasury Department. He was Director of Retirement Research at Towers Watson. And he was an economist at both the IRS and the Federal Reserve Board. The second panelist will be Louise Scheiner. She is the Robert S. Kerr Senior Fellow in Economic Studies and also Policy Director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution. Prior to Brookings, Louise was a senior economist with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And again, also a long and distinguished career, among other things, a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury and a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors and also at the Joint Committee on Taxation, so congressional experience as well. Let me conclude with a little administrative matter, which is that we will try to have a question and answer period following our discussion. We'll see how that goes. And we welcome questions, obviously, from the audience here, but also from those who are watching remotely. And I'll just remind you, those who are watching remotely, to look at the announcement for this meeting, to submit questions to cameron.towerbell@aei.org, or apparently on Twitter at hashtag AskAEIHealth. And so with that, Mark, take it away.
Okay, let's get the slides up. Wrong slides. Sorry? Keep going.
Of course.
All right, there we go. Here we are. All right, so I'm going to be speaking about federal spending on Social Security, Medicare, and health care. And I have 9 substantive slides, and I will discuss some of the issues with regard to the CBO assumptions. But I do want to really, one of the main points here is the role of Social Security and Medicare and health care programs of the federal government more broadly in the federal budget deficit and debt problem. And I characterize it as a problem and potentially a very serious problem. And to look at the historical development of this and then the projections. Part of the development of the problem, it comes from deeper parameters of demographics, of the aging population, and what we've been talking about, the cost of healthcare growth, even beyond inflation, as well as the role of the interest rate. These topics have been mentioned quite a bit, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper. So this is historical, and this is in dollar terms. So Social Security is a relatively recent contributor to the budget problem. And what we say by the net budget is this is subtracting out the dedicated taxes, the payroll taxes, and premiums that go to Social Security and to Medicare. So Social Security used to be actually a positive to the budget, but in 2010 it turned negative, and it continues to grow negative. That's the yellow. And then Medicare, I think, as everyone realizes, is largely funded by the general budget. That's almost entirely true, except for premiums for the physicians and the drug benefit, but it's also partially true for the HI, and that's the orange. So we see, going through 2021, increasingly large negative drain on the budget of these entitlement programs. In other words, they're baked into the cake, and they, with no changes, they will continue to to be negative and grow larger and larger negative. So by 2021, it was a negative $500 billion. The next slide puts this in context of GDP and also comparing it to the deficit. So again, you know, in the 2 decades ago, Medicare and Social Security were very small contributors to the deficit, and the deficits actually weren't very large. Obviously, you know, as Phil indicated, that with the Great Recession and then with the pandemic, we see really remarkably large deficits, amazingly large, and so Social Security and Medicare seem rather small in comparison. But if you look at more quote-unquote normal times, so for example 2015, where the deficit, you know, was in more of a normal range, just on the range of a little more than 2%, it was almost all Social Security and Medicare. And if you look at the projection, that continues to be the case. You know, as Phil indicated, in the CBO projections, there are no crises. There are no really bad outcomes. There's no recession. There's no war. None of that happens, and so it's just very smooth. And basically, what you're seeing here is that you know, the deficit grows and grows and grows because of what's structural. So that's Social Security. That's the yellow line, which grows further and further. That's Medicare, which grows more and more. And then you have the total federal deficit as a percent of GDP, which by 2040 is you know, basically a negative 8% of GDP. And I think, as Phil indicated, in addition to the Social Security and Medicare problem, we have an additional problem, and that is because the debt is so large, we have to service that debt, and we have to pay interest on it, and that begins to really become noticeable, and so that the brown line, you know, gets even further away from already the structural problem of Social Security and Medicare. It takes a larger share. So, you know, I guess I appreciate Phil's optimism, but it's given the difficulty of changing these very essential programs, the entitlement programs, you know, it's I think a little challenging. So let's sort of move from also Social Security, but to look also at other health care programs. So that's Medicaid, that's CHIP, and then the marketplace subsidies as part of the ACA. That also has been growing. Now here I'm looking at it as a share of the federal budget. This is historical from 2000, and you see that healthcare expenditures are now about 30% of the budget. 2020 and 2021, of course, were exceptional because of other expenditures in the budget. But in general, again, the structure of the budget is that it's becoming more and more devoted to healthcare. And that seems to be the direction of politically where we're going as well. And so it's actually very important, you know, to get those projections right. And here I will sort of have my first substantive comment about some of the assumptions. So this next one is the CBO projections. So it continues to grow. It's up to 40% by 2052 of the budget. And this is you know, Medicare, and you know, is growing. And what's surprising, and that was Jim's question, and I think really we need a more precise answer about this. Is what's going on with Medicaid in these projections? It doesn't seem to grow, which is very surprising because a big part of Medicaid, at least a third now, and it should increase, is for long-term care, and of course that relates to the aging of the population. And so we would have expected to see that that would increase proportionally, and we're not seeing that. So either there's an offset someplace in the subsidies for ACA or other parts of Medicaid, or maybe they're not really doing a full demographic projection for Medicaid. And I think that's something that is definitely worth exploring more deeply. The other thing that I'll note, and I'll comment here, this is a sort of a little bit of an advertisement for future work that I'm working on, is, you know, as healthcare becomes more and more a part of the budget, and also just more and more a part of the economy. Healthcare is now 20% of GDP. I think we need maybe a little bit of a different macroeconomic model that integrates better healthcare as part of explaining what's going on in GDP. Because usually, the way CBO and pretty much everyone is that sort of they project GDP and then they project healthcare, and there's sort of no interaction. And I think there should be an interaction. I think there is an interaction economically, and I think that's something that should be done going forward as a methodological change. As I've already indicated, a big part of what's going on here is demographics. This is, very hard to change because a lot of it is a result of past history in terms of the baby boom and the birth rate. And here I do want to sort of call out to CBO and congratulate them on being, I think, realistic in terms of fertility. They actually lowered their rate from 1.8 to 1.75 as a fertility rate. This seems to me very realistic based on surveys, based on certainly recent experience, which was 1.65, 1.64. And just looking at survey data, women's expectations of having children, et cetera. And I'll note the contrast to the trustees report, which actually raised it last year to 2.0, which is really an inexplicable change given the actual evidence here. So it seems as if to me that CBO has got this right, and I think that obviously makes a big difference in the long run. The other thing to note is the demographics are important not just to Social Security, but they're important to Medicare and to healthcare spending. And why is that the case? Well, this again is a sort of an obvious point, but it's that we spend a lot more for older people, and it's just I think helpful to see how much more. And again, it's sort of I'm going back to my other point about long-term care. A big part of the 85 age group premium of spending is because of long-term care, and so I think that as I said before, warrants its own separate modeling. I think Phil mentioned this, and Jim asked him about this, is the question of healthcare costs and inflation for healthcare. And they made some changes that basically, in the long run, brought that down. I think it's an interesting point in terms of looking at recent history. It's certainly true that looking at these deflators, that healthcare inflation has been moderate, and that may be a justification for this change that CBO made for the long run. But I think we need to understand better what is going on and what's permanent and what's not. It seems as if a lot does relate to these budget rules for Medicare, and are those really sustainable? So therefore, I think we need to dig deeper in terms of what really are the fundamentals of healthcare cost growth, technology, and structure in that sector. So let me just then come to the final factor, which is really important, and that's interest rates. And I think we've already discussed that there's certainly a risk here, and I think it's a very substantial risk because, and I think Phil said this, he was pretty candid about it, is that he has a pretty modest projection of interest rates going forward. So by 2052, he has the 10-year Treasury at 4.2%, which I think historically, certainly over the last 30 years, would be viewed as very modest. But really the question is the interaction of these very large budget deficits and interest rates. And they do have it in the CBO. It's basically, they have an assumption that, based on some analysis that they did, that for every increase in the ratio of debt to GDP of 1 percentage point, the interest rate, the 10-year Treasury, goes up by 2.5 basis points. Here, I'm not going to obviously have time to go through this whole regression, but I've done the analysis basically using a similar model to what CBO does, based on Ernie Tedeschi's work, who's now at the CEA. There's a long literature, a long history of this analysis. My number is basically the relationship is closer to 5 basis points. And if that's true, you basically get an interest rate in 2052 of 6%, which is not seemingly, out of expectations. But if you get that, basically you have a debt to GDP ratio of 235, and then we're getting to the realm of, I think, real risk, because it's certainly possible that interest rates could spike in different directions, and you get a situation of things can get bad very quickly. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the good news. Louise?
So now I have to go back. How do I do this? Back. Now that's some fills. There we go. Great. Thanks. Oh, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to talk about sort of a big picture about how CBO talks about the long-term deficit and how we think about it. And sort of, CBO is actually the most influential voice on fiscal issues in the U.S. They may not tell Congress what to do, but they really determine on how we speak about fiscal issues. And so how they tell the story, I think, is more important than the exact numbers. What do they assume about interest rates? Like there's obviously assumptions and there's room for change, but how they tell a story is really important. What charts they use, what exercises they perform, they really influence the debate. And so I'm going to focus on that. So as we've seen today, most of the focus has been on the debt to GDP ratio, which I don't think is the best gauge of our fiscal situation. It doesn't account for the fact that interest rates are really, really low in historical perspective and expected to be low for the long term. CBO has been highlighting interest payments, as you saw this morning, as Phil was highlighting, as a share of GDP, which does sort of capture the fact that interest rates are lower. But even that isn't a good measure of the cost of debt, as I'll show you. So I'm going to offer some alternative ways to think and look about the cost of debt. So really, how do you think about the cost of debt, that flow cost? There's sort of three ways to talk about it. So there's the nominal interest, right? So that's just the interest rate times the debt. If you pay the nominal interest on your debt, the nominal value of the debt stays the same. So if you have a $100 debt and interest rate is 3%, if you pay $3, your debt is still $100. Okay, so that's number one. You could do that. Let's keep the nominal value of the debt from one year to the next the same. You could say, well, no, but there's inflation. And so I don't need my debt to stay at 100. It can move with inflation and still be the same real debt. So then I could pay the real interest rate. So what is that? That's the nominal interest rates minus the inflation. So I minus pi in eco-speak times the debt. So pay that and your real debt to GDP, your real debt stays the same. But what if you said, no, I just want to keep the debt to GDP ratio the same, right? That's what we think about a sustainable debt, where your debt to GDP ratio isn't going off to infinity. So what would I have to pay on the debt to keep my debt to GDP ratio the same? Then you have to pay what's I minus G, which is the interest rate minus the growth rate of the economy, right? So if your debt is 100 and the economy is growing 5% and your interest rate is 8%, if you just pay 3%, then your debt grows to 105, your economy is at 105, and your debt to GDP ratio is still 100. So to keep the debt to GDP ratio, that is why people have focused so much. If you hear the debate of R minus G, it's I minus G, R minus G, either way. It's because that really determines sort of what is happening to your debt to GDP ratio. And what does it mean to make interest payments on the debt? You can write them in a budget, as Phil did, but to make the payments, to actually make them, means you have to run a primary surplus. In other words, you can't be borrowing a whole bunch here and making payments. That's not really making payments, right? So you have to be running a primary surplus equal to those, to I minus G, okay? So CBO has, so we can talk a little bit about interest rates. CBO's interest rate path has I minus G negative, so that actually you don't have to make any interest payments on the debt. For I can't remember what it is, I can't remember when it turns, but it does turn at the end of their projection, but for on average for the next 30 years, it's negative. And CBO interest rates are higher than what you would get from looking at market participant rates. Now, that doesn't mean market participants' rates, and market participants might be expecting the Congress to change the rules. Like they may not be expecting the debt to GDP ratio to get up to 180% of GDP or 100 or 200. But they are higher than what people expect. They're higher than what other academics have looked at too, because although increases in the debt are going to increase interest rates, I think everybody agrees with that, the factors that have been holding down interest rates for so long, things like productivity, slow productivity, population aging, rising inequality, these things that we think are fundamental, they're not about what the Fed does. They're about the fundamental interest rates that keep the economy in balance, right, which the Fed has to follow, right? Those things are going to keep going and keep pushing downward on interest rates. So it's possible that even though we're going to have upward pressure from the debt, we're going to have downward pressure from these things that have been leading to low interest rates. And so academics, some academics think that CBO's rates are even higher. But still, forget that. Even with CBO's rates incorporated the fact that debt to GDP ratio is going up to 200% or whatever it is, I can't remember right now, but they incorporated that huge rise in the debt, and they're still really, really low and on average less than the growth rate of the economy over the next 30 years. Okay, so what can you do? So if you look at this picture, I am comparing on the left side the nominal interest rates, that's what Phil showed you this morning, nominal interest payments as a share of GDP, to the real rates, and then on the right, nominal to what I call the sustainable rates, which is what you would have to pay to keep the debt to GDP ratio constant. So if you're comparing real to nominal, you see that there's a rise in both, right? As Phil said, they're all kind of correlated, right? So they're both rising over time. But if you think about how scared would you be? And you're saying, oh my God, if you look at the nominal, you're like, oh my God, it's way out of historical. We've never had 8%. But the reals, barely get above the historical experience until the end of the projection, okay? If you go to the right and you look at the sustainable, it doesn't even get positive until the end. That means that sort of debt is sort of like you can run a deficit without your debt to GDP going up over this period. So it's a really, really different way of looking at it. It's a lot less scary, right? It doesn't mean that we don't have a problem. It doesn't mean that debt to GDP can go up forever, because the more debt to GDP goes up, the more those interest rates are going to go up. So you are going to definitely sort of create the situation where you're going to have that reverse, which means that it's not costly to have debt, because it's just going to raise interest rates at some point, right at the margin. But it's a different way of looking at it. It's way less scary, okay? And also just more reflective of the actual cost of servicing debt, right? You don't just look at your value of your mortgage. You say, well, what are my interest payments on the mortgage? I can have a big mortgage without a lot of stress on my budget if interest rates are low. And so it's kind of try to incorporate that. Okay, the other way you could think about it is, instead of looking at deficits, you could look at something that's similar but not the same, which is the change in the debt to GDP ratio, right? So this is moving away from this sort of weird, I think a little bit weird, we got the flow of deficits over the stock of GDP, to look at this change in debt to GDP ratio. And again, as you can see, we have a problem. Look, we have a structural change in our economy. We have an aging economy. We're running primary deficits now. We can't continue to do this forever. But the trajectory just looks flatter. It's not rising as fast. It's not as urgent a priority. It's just a little bit of a different focus, right? It's still the same basic underlying story, but the magnitudes are a lot smaller. Okay, so that's sort of how to present it. Then the question is, okay, so CBO doesn't just present it. It also says, okay, so I can show you these pictures, but it's really hard to understand what does that mean. So they do things like, what would you have to do to fix the situation? What does that mean? So the way they do it, so this chart is not in the report, but the numbers in the chart are from the report, and the chart was like this in a previous report. So they say, okay, imagine by 2052, you want to have some target debt to GDP ratio. So they choose 100 today's or 80 before COVID, right? So first of all, they're only choosing 80 and 100. They're not choosing 125. So that's kind of, it's not quite balanced, because as I showed you, even with 150, your debt, the interest payments are quite low. So it takes up relatively, it takes in some sense a one-sided view on debt to GDP, which is that you can't go higher than today and you want to go lower maybe. And so then they compare. So if you start acting in 2027, you'd have to lower the deficit by 2.8% of GDP. To get 100% of GDP as your target in 2052, to get an 80% target, so to bring it down over time over the next 30 years, you'd have to do something more, 3.5. So then they say, okay, well, what does delaying do? Like, this is the whole thing, like you can act now, or you can wait, you can act later, or you can act later. And oh my God, look what happens if you don't act now. So if you don't act now, if you don't act in 2027, and instead you act in 2032, you go from 3.5 to 4.3. Okay? If you wait until 37, you have to go 5.7% of GDP. So it's really, really bad, right? So two things about that. One, they're not changing the target date. 2052 is the target date. So imagine we didn't act till 2051. Like, oh my God, we'd have to do so much in 1 year, right? There's nothing special about 2052. If you took this measure of 5.7% of GDP cut in 2037, you hit the target in 2052, and then debt to GDP ratio would be going down towards 0. So what they're basically saying is somehow you have this target, you don't move, you don't move, you don't move, then you have to do this huge move, and then you come back down, right? That's not what a policy would do, right? So that's just, I don't think, the right way of doing it. And the other thing is, it looks like it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, but it's not counting the fact that for 10 or 20 years, people are having higher government spending, lower taxes. Those are trade-offs, right? It's sort of presented as like no trade-off. It's just bad. It's bad to wait. It's bigger number, right? So recently, I think they've moved in a different direction. Not in their long-term budget report, but they have a report in 2022. They're thinking about this, obviously. And what they do here is they compare policies that stabilize the debt, which is what we all think about. We don't want it to going off to infinity, but at different levels. Let's stabilize it at 150. Let's stabilize it at 130. Let's stabilize it at 100. They look at the effects on different cohorts. So they're going to capture the fact that, like, if you don't act now, today's cohorts do better, right? And so we can compare. We can understand the trade-offs. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I still think they're sort of getting to this level sort of arbitrarily determined in 2052. Another thing you could do, if you want to think about what are the costs of debt, the cost of debt are basically the fact that you have to pay higher interest, right? I'm not particularly worried about the U.S., sort of people not being able to lend to the U.S. because our tax rate is quite low. We have ways of moving up to pay off any debt. So I think people believe our debt is going to be paid off, and even at the debt to GDP ratios projected, I don't think there's going to be worry that U.S. is going to pay its debts. But there's a cost to that. It's that interest cost, right? And so one thing you could say is, what if I just do whatever I act today, and I do whatever it takes to stabilize the debt at whatever level it stabilizes? How much does that cost, right? And that's a way of sort of saying, if I want to just do a one-time thing on every generation, every person, every year, right? How much is that? So that I never have to act again in some sense, unless the laws change or anything. So I think it's just a different way of looking at it, same thing, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. That was pretty fast. I don't think I caught it all.
Sorry. I talk fast.
How much time do we have
left? We have
left?
no time anyhow, see?
Do we have 1 minute left?
See? That's why.
Oh my goodness. Terribly sorry. We're going to keep going, obviously. Yeah. So a question that comes to my mind, really with respect to yours, but it applies to both of yours, is how do we know what the right level of debt is? I mean, how do you make that decision? The fact is that there's nothing special about wherever we are now, about 102% or something. There's nothing special about that. At one time, it was 45% of GDP. Macroeconomists were pretty happy with that. In the current generation of macroeconomists, they seem to be pretty happy with 102%. I could see a time when we got to 200%. Regrettably, with the way Congress seems to be going, I think we may be headed in that direction. But there are obviously some trade-offs there. The higher the debt, something must happen. Something in the real world must happen. So maybe we could just talk about what we think that would be, other than raising interest rates, which Mark's last slide kind of addresses that. But there are some real consequences of a higher level of debt, especially if it's an astoundingly higher level of debt. My view is that there's a question about whether U.S. dollar as the reserve currency will remain the reserve currency. I think that's an issue for extreme levels. At lower levels, maybe that's less of an issue. Maybe if you edge up to it. But anyway, that's one issue. Are there other factors that we need to consider here about what target level of debt we ought to have?
So economists don't have an answer for what that right level of debt was. There was this paper that was cited a lot, like that something happens at 90% of debt to GDP ratio. That paper was wrong. There were errors in the paper, just not right. So it's just about trade-offs, right, as you say. And so the interest rate, you can think about the interest rate, that's sort of thinking about it from a budget perspective. Where does the higher interest rate come from? It comes from the fact that when the government debt is higher, it's soaking up private capital that would otherwise go to private savings. Right. And so therefore, the way to equilibrate that market of supply and demand for savings is that the interest rate goes up and private savings falls, because with a higher interest rate, private projects aren't worth it. And so it's the same issue. It's not a different issue. You can look at it from the macro perspective, which is that we maybe will have less growth because we have less private investment, or you can look at it from a budget perspective to say higher interest rates will hurt us. It's the same issue kind of looked at from a different perspective. Therefore, it's also important to remember that you have to think about what, as you said, but what the government spending is going toward. So if the government spending is going toward valuable public investment, then you may be better off with a bigger deficit and more public investment and less private investment if we're at a place where the public investment has higher returns than the private investment. The fact that interest rates have been coming down are so low is kind of suggestive of the fact that the private investment that's being crowded out is not that valuable, right? Which is why the interest rates are so low. So the other thing I think is really interesting and important is there has been, over the last 10 years, a ton of research where you can follow spending that a lot of people would say, oh, that's not investment, it's just spending. Spending on healthcare for kids, housing for kids, money to poor families. You can actually follow kids who, like, when the Medicaid was rolled out or food stamps were rolled out county by county, you can sort of do this really rigorous analysis of the kids who got it for more of their childhood. How do they do? And you see these tremendous rates of return on things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as investment, which is the kids go to college more, they get married, they have better jobs, they have higher earnings, they have better health, crime goes down. So I think that when you think about these trade-offs, you really do have to think about what am I spending the money on and what is that going to do? Because the only reason we really care about debt is because of this intergenerational trade-off, right? We think about debt as sort of being good for us, but hurting the future. But if it's debt that's for the future, for fighting climate change, then that changes it. So that's mine.
Yeah, I'll just add another point, and that is, it really is about interest rates and whether they're low or high. I mean, a lot of it, all of this really depends on that. And I think the question of why interest rates have been so low, surprisingly low, in the last few years, I think what we're learning in the recent experience is the Fed policy is a big part of it. Jim mentioned monetizing the debt. That's what the Fed was doing. So that kept interest rates very low, and the risk there is inflation. So I think really that's the other thing that that goes on here is there is an enhanced risk of inflation.
So I don't agree with that. I think that the Fed would say that the reason that interest rates have been falling is something structural about the economy for the reasons I talked about: productivity, inequality, because rich people save more, all these various factors. And so what the Fed is trying to do in balancing its mandate is to find the interest rates that doesn't create inflation, and the interest rate that doesn't create inflation has been falling over time, the real interest rate, right? So they call this R star or whatever. That's what they're gauging. So when they're saying, is monetary policy expansive or restrictive, it's relative to what? Relative to that neutral equilibrium rate. That's the rate that's been falling a lot. It's true, recently they've been behind the curve. Inflation started, a lot of it because of supply shocks, but now we're worried of getting expectations, and so they kind of made a mistake. But you can see that they're fixing it. They have a dual mandate, and they take it quite seriously, and they haven't allowed inflation, except for a very short period of time coming from COVID, right? We've had extremely low inflation on average over the past 20 years, below their 2% target. They weren't even able to make the target. So it's not as if we had a lot of inflation inflating away the debt. And now that we do have an inflation, they're taking steps, even having a recession, to take steps to bring it back down. So I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I don't think it is the Fed. The Fed follows the structure of the economy, not the other way around.
So I think this really illustrates how difficult it is to manage an economy from Washington. It's really very difficult because we don't have that great information about the past. We certainly don't have any information about the future. We don't really understand the mechanisms by which productivity is created. We don't really understand it. We talk about it, but we don't know. And we don't have a very good handle also on, let me think of it as the next new thing coming out of the private sector. In other words, you can't really tell, the government cannot tell what is going to come down the road that is going to create the productivity boost, ideally not productivity bust. I mean, in healthcare, it's mostly productivity bust, but every place else, I would say it's.
I don't agree with you on that either.
Yeah, well,
I think properly measured productivity in healthcare has been pretty high.
Over 100 years, I think that's right. Over a few years, I think that's probably not right. But in any event,
a discussion for another day.
Yeah, in any event, we can't measure productivity and health very well. But my real point is that it goes back to what is our target, and also if we're going to have a lot more federal spending, even if it's for the right thing, federal spending does not come with just money being sent out to wherever it's supposed to go. It also comes with regulations. And so another aspect of this that needs to be considered is what are we buying? What's the trade-off between potentially very favorable federal spending and potentially not so favorable federal regulation, which may in fact dampen the next new thing out of the private sector? I think to me, that's a very big concern. And these are all trade-offs. So obviously, we're not answering any questions at all. So don't thank us for that. But these are trade-offs that need to be considered. And I think these are the kind of trade-offs that CBO spends a lot of time thinking about and tries to avoid telling us what they really think. Any other reaction? Or
the other thing, I was very encouraged to hear that from Phil that they are going to do this scenario modeling, in terms of what could go good and what could go bad. I think they've got the model, so I think it's helpful to just, press it a little bit.
Yeah. I don't see any questions here. Are there any questions from the audience, or questions or accusations? Either one. Uh-oh, I think thank you. Please say who you are and, form your accusation in the form of a question.
Hi, I'm Brian Stubbe. I had a question for Louise. In your presentation, I thought it was really interesting trying to focus on different ways to measure sustainability of the payments. There was one graph, maybe this is kind of in the weeds, but I think it was charting deficit percentage and then real deficit percentage. And towards the end of like 2050, they diverged in a way that didn't make sense to me unless inflation was increasing. Or maybe I was missing something there, but that was my question, kind of.
I think what's happening is, I'd have to go look and try to look at it, but I think, how when debt you start to get this cycle of debt rising really, really fast. And so, no, actually, that's not it. I cannot, it's too in the weeds for me to tell you right now what's going on. But it's just going to be that same debt times the difference in the interest rate. So there's obviously the interest rate is moving over time, and I don't know what's happening. I don't remember what's happening to the nominal versus the real interest rate in the CBO. It's just taking the CBO, it's I times D or I minus inflation times D. So, and whether or not it really is diverging or it's just the way that the chart is. I can go look. I don't remember. I did these a few months ago, so it's not like I did them yesterday, or I would probably have a better sense.
Well, very good. Well, thank you very much to the audience here and online, and thank you to our great panel for an interesting discussion. Please join me in.